So this morning I'm reading IsraeliNationalNews.com and I see an article that goes into great detail this generation's betrayal of the Jews in the Holy Land. In the context of the British Mandate. Before I get started, to remind myself and to remind everyone to never forget what the Christians in Europe did to the Jews and the followers of Yeshua. I'm wearing the clothing of shame and the yellow star that was forced upon the Jews by the Christians and Muslims, but by the Christians in Europe for nearly 2,000 years, in honor of those who fell by the sword in Europe, either because they were a Jew or because they were a true follower of Yeshua Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. And may they receive vengeance and let it be paid in full. The article is 50 years of the two-state solution blackmail by David Heilbronn Price. This is a very, very, very good article. It proves what I have been saying. Some of the things that I have been saying on my YouTube video, they sound preposterous. I have said that the name Palestine was coined by Rome in order to blot the name of Israel forever. That's what it was designed to do. And so the Palestine Mandate was the British mandate for the Holy Land. And Palestine has nothing to do with the Arabs. Never did. This is the reason why I always call the Palestinians, the Arabs, fake-stinians. They're fakes and frauds. The name Palestine or Palestinian is a fake and a fraud anyway. And when we go through this article, you will see why that is the case and why the Jews changed the name of Palestine to Israel again. You see, when the Romans thought that they could destroy the name, bury the name, eliminate the name of Israel forever, they were wrong. The name of Israel was raised from the dead in 1948. Now, let me go ahead and start reading this article. Speaking after the visit of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Brussels, the EU's foreign policy chief Federica Mogherini made an astonishing declaration of ignorance again. We always say that the two-state solution is the only realistic one, she said. I have not heard by anyone or from anyone, not only in the last weeks but in the last decades, any other idea than two states to preserve Israeli security. The Palestinians need to have their own country under their own authority. One reinforced with Hamas, weaponized by Iran and aimed at the destruction of Israel, or one with an elected democratic peaceful government. Urging the EU to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, Mr. Netanyahu said, "While I respect Europe, I am not prepared to accept a double standard from it." It is a pity the Israeli Prime Minister does not make more frequent visits to point out blatant hypocrisy. The previous visit by an Israeli Prime Minister was 22 years ago. So much for the allegedly powerful Israeli lobby. Under the British mandate, Palestinian was a term for a Jew, or was a term for Jew. That's right. Hence, we could also add theft of nationality by the Soviet KGB disinformation service. That's right, folks. To hypocrisy. Palestinians are not mentioned in the famous 1967 UN Resolution 242. Why? Because they did not exist. The real Palestinians had changed their names to Israelis. Did you get that, folks? Egypt's dictator Nasser and the Soviet communists had invented the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1964 to Arabize and communize the entire territory of the Palestinian Mandate. That included the kingdom across the Jordan River. So you see where this lie came from, folks? Russia. And the European Union bought it hook, line, and sinker. Why did the Europeans take the bait? We will go on through this article and you will see why they took the bait. And this is disgusting. For a viable solution, perhaps High Representative Mogherini should look further back. Let's say before she was born in 1973. Perhaps she should also look at home at the European community itself, the Schuman Plan principle that brought real change and peace to former Nazis, communists, and anti-Semites. Europe also proved the stupidity of the two-state solution. Its experience extends not just over the last decades, but over a period of more than 2,000 years. The two-state solution coincides with the first major attempt to blackmail Western Europe's foreign policy. It dates from the 1967 Six-Day War. This year is the 50th birthday. Oil blackmail still does not work. It should be recalled that in 1967 there was little that could be called European foreign policy. Foreign policy was a national affair. The European communities provided the only legitimate frame. They could make international agreements only in very specific sectors. The European Coal and Steel Community was founded when coal was the main fuel in Europe. Euratom was created to exploit the oil-free energy of nuclear industry and provide for nuclear non-proliferation. The European Economic Community, with its customs union, brought the dimensions of international trade agreements. Only these three communities could make legal European law. The founding fathers of European unity, Robert Schuman, initiator of the European Communities, the Council of Europe, and NATO, was sensitive to real Arab interests. Algeria was then an integral part of France. France had colonies and protectorates along the Mediterranean and in Africa. But he was pro-Israel. He was prime minister in the crucial period of November 1947 to July 1948. and foreign minister from 1948 to 1953. He instructed France to cast its United Nations vote in favor of Israel. Warnings were made in the 1950s about Europe's increasing reliance on oil. The 1956 Suez Crisis showed how fragile links to the Middle East oil were. However, despite the attempts of the good, I'm going to put that in quotes because it ain't coming from me, the good Europeans to face up to potential Islamist energy blackmail by combining the defense of the three communities. The policy was blocked by one factor. General de Gaulle took power in 1957. He changed the foreign policy of France from a pro-Israel to a pro-Arab one because of oil. This was myopic. In the 1967 oil crisis, France got off the hook. But the Arab oil exporters wanted to use the oil weapon to change the foreign policy of other major states. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Libya, and Algeria stopped oil shipments to the United States. West Germany and the United Kingdom were not yet member of the communities. Why? Because those countries were directly or indirectly helping Israel and did not want to maintain a pre-1967 ceasefire lines as borders. And they weren't friendly to Islamic indoctrination. That is the real birth of oil blackmail aimed at dictating to the world an Islamic anti-Israel foreign policy. Although the British came up with a two-state solution first, it was a temporary political measure. Oh, that word temporary, how deceiving it is. In 1923, the British lobbed the biggest chunk of the Palestine Mandate territory east of the Jordan and gave it to the Hashemite Abdullah, expelled from Saudi Arabia and dismissed from Iraq. Bad move. You see, I'm stopping right here. That land is the Holy Land. That land that the British gave to the Hashemites. It wasn't theirs to give to the Hashemites. They were supposed to stand by the Balfour Declaration, which was to provide a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And Palestine, all of Palestine was for the Jews. All of it. And now you see how the Egyptians and the Russians, the KGB, the communists, deceived the whole world by successfully, in the eyes of the world, making the Arabs the Palestinians, which in fact they are not. Bad move. That move was without full legal approval of the of the League of Nations. No other European state recognized the Transjordan. In other words, the Transjordan those people are treading on holy ground, ground that does not belong to them. Nor did Saudi Arabia under the Wahhabis. Nor did any other country who fancied getting some oil. Only Pakistan. Only Pakistan recognized what the British had done. The betrayal, the knife in the back that the British had done in 1923. In 1937, the British suggested a two-state solution in the Peel White Paper to further reduce Israel. It had no traction. In 1973, the Arab oil exporting countries OPEC, again deployed the oil weapon to change global politics. It first tried a total oil embargo for some states, cuts of 5% per month for others, and then it quadrupled the price, shutting down the European economy. It also imposed poverty and seemingly endless wars upon developing countries. Then it quadrupled the prices again. So much for Saudi sympathy for fellow Arabs, and even less for Europeans. If the EU foreign policy chief cannot imagine any other policy than Saudi Arabia's two-state solution, it is because she and many of her officials are now the defenders of Saudi oil blackmail policy that rules in Europe and the United Nations. They drank it in with their mother's milk. Yes, when they were babies, they drank it in. They were taught from their youth. For decades after World War II, the price of oil was under $2 a barrel. It gave oil exporters fat profits, yachts, and a playboy lifestyle. $2 then is an equivalent to under $10 today. Massive oil fields have since been discovered. Under the oil cartel OPEC, the price rose to nearly $150 a barrel. At that point, the oil blackmail graft amounted to about 10% of global GDP. Some blackmail. Saudi Aramco is the richest company in the world, bar none. Europe put an end to hypocrisy. Resisting blackmail would be useful too. So, folks, apparently, Europe and the British preferred oil for the truth. Like Esau, who sold his birthright. Yes, like Esau, who sold his birthright for one bowl of soup, so has the British and Europe sold their salvation. Yes, I said that. They have sold their salvation for a barrel of oil. You see, we just read, and this is all true. Everything in this article is true. There is not one stitch of untruth in this article. Everything that the Europeans and the British did to Israel, every betrayal from the British Mandate onward, was due to buying one more barrel of oil on the cheap. The desire to buy one more barrel of oil on the cheap. And yet, we read in Romans 11 that any Roman who desires salvation by grace must consider themselves to be brethren of the Jew. Read Romans 11 and you will see. They must consider themselves to be the brethren of the branches, the 12 branches. But what did they do? They threw the branches under the bus. Let's go to Romans 11. Now you got to understand, folks, that the British, this this chapter. It takes in the British because they were, and by most accounts still are, a Roman entity because they have their Roman kings. No, the kingdom in Great Britain are not Hebrew. Hebrews do not wear Nazi costumes and do the Hitler salute. Just to get that out of the way. So, in Romans 11, Paul is talking to, guess what? The Roman church. Verse 11, I say then, have they, Israel, stumbled that they should fall? Well, the problem is the Roman church today would say yes. But Paul said no. Paul went further. He said, Jehovah forbid. But rather because of their temporary fall, is what it should read, salvation is also come to the Gentiles in order to provoke Israel to jealousy. Now, if the temporary fall of them be the riches of the Gentile world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, which it became, folks. No question about it. The Europeans, Rome, benefited greatly monetarily from the fall of Israel. How much more than their fullness? In other words, how much greater is the riches of Israel going to be when they're brought back? Paul is saying that the riches of Israel is going to be far greater than the riches of the European, Roman, Gentile world is today, when Israel is completely and fully repatriated with their Messianic king. Guaranteed. This is what Paul is saying here. And he says, verse 13, for I speak to you Gentiles because I am the apostle to the Gentiles. Now, he was the only apostle to the Gentiles. So these words to the Romans, they stand today. The Romans all the way from Great Britain to Moscow. He says, I magnify my office. If by any means so he would provoke those of his flesh, Israel, by any means, so that he could save some of them in his generation. Remember that generation was a generation that received the punishment, or was to receive the Israel's tribulation. For, in verse 15, for if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the Gentile world, then what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? Now, folks, he's talking about Israel as a nation receiving life from the dead, which happened in 1948. But also those that are laying dead around the Mount of Olives and around the world. So when Israel is restored, those hundreds of thousands of people laying in their graves in the Mount of Olives, those Jews will be raised from the dead. And I dare say that all the Jews around the world scattered in all those locations will be raised from the dead. Verse 16, for if the first fruit is holy, if the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, not that false Roman Messiah that all these houses of worship have over on the ceiling. No, the Jewish Messiah. If the first fruit be holy, the entire lump is also holy, which means each and every single one of the tribes of Israel, including Dan, is also holy. And if the root be holy, if the Hebrew Jewish Messiah is holy, looks like a Jew, not like a European, then so are each and every one of the 12 branches of Israel are holy. Now, some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive branch were grafted in among them, and alongside them partake of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. Well, the problem is, according to this article, even in this generation, as has been done in previous generations all the way back to 70 AD, what have the Romans done? They murdered the branches, they pillaged the branches, they raped the branches, they burned the branches with fire. They did. And according to Paul, if you do it to the branches, if you rape, pillage, murder, and burn the branches with fire, then you have done the same thing to Israel's Messiah, to Jerusalem's Messiah. You have done it to him. That's what it says. Boast not against the branches, because if you boast, you don't bear the root, but the root bears you. You will say then the branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. But what has happened? What happened in 1923? High-mindedness. Fornication. Yes, fornication is the selling of something that is of great value to you for something that is of far less value. It is like what Esau did with his birthright. He sold his birthright for one bowl of soup. And it is written, don't be as Esau, the fornicator, who for one bowl of soup sold his birthright. Well, then you see the reason why in Isaiah 34, how his sword, Jehovah's sword, is going to be bathed in Edomia, which is Esau, and how he's going to destroy all the nations because they violated the everlasting covenant. What is the everlasting covenant? The everlasting covenant is the Israelites have to be brought back to the Holy Land and forgiven, and their iniquities be remembered no more. That is the everlasting covenant to Israel. But the nations violated that covenant. You see, in order for the nations to be saved, they would have to partake of that covenant along with Israel, along with the Jews. That's exactly what it says right here in Romans 11. And nobody, and I mean nobody, is willing, has the guts, has the fortitude to point this out in Romans 11. For if Jehovah spared not the natural branches, take heed, lest he also not spare you. Be careful, behold the goodness and the severity of our Father in heaven. On them which fell severity, but toward you goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Did the Romans and the British, did they continue in his goodness? No. They forsook his goodness by dealing treacherously with the one who was supposed to be their brethren, the Jew, Israel. And by doing so, they became Esau. By going after Israel to murder, pillage, rape, and burn, they followed the way of Esau and the way of Cain, rejecting salvation and rejecting the everlasting covenant as written in Isaiah 34. And they also, or he said otherwise, he says, if you don't continue in his goodness, you're going to be cut off. Well, we've already established that the Roman churches refused to continue in his goodness. If this was not a possibility, then Paul would have never had to warn about this. Never. But not only did Paul know it was a possibility that this could happen, which is the reason why he wrote this chapter 11 to start with, he knew it was going to happen, which is the reason why he wrote about the man of sin in Thessalonians. Yes, he knew it was going to happen. And that's the reason for this warning in this chapter. Verse 23, and Israel, if they abide still not in unbelief, and that day is coming, that day is guaranteed. There is a promise in the prophets. No, not a promise. Promise after promise after promise in the prophets, guaranteeing that he is going to wake Israel up. Cause them to see the error of their way and bring them back. That is a guaranteed promise. And you know who else says it's a guaranteed promise? Paul himself. So he says, now if you were cut out of the wild olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, Israel, who are the natural branches, who are the natural branches? Okay. Judah, Benjamin, Levi, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Dan, Reuben, Joseph, It's a shame I can't even remember them all. My old age. Each and every one of the tribes. Those who were the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree. How much more? A lot more, folks. Verse 25, for I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery. But the Roman church today wants to bury it. The European nations are trying to bury this truth. But this truth is going to rise from the dead, even if it means Europe's extinction. Lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. In other words, there are a limited amount of Gentiles who will come into the grace of Jehovah by Yeshua Messiah. There is a set number. And once that number has been filled, then the Gentiles are going to be cut off and Israel is going to be brought back to grace. Yes, to grace. Verse 26, and so all Israel shall be saved. And there is the promise I was telling you about. He's just reaffirming the promise that is written in the prophets over and over and over again. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written. He says, as it is written. And where? In the prophets. There shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant. That is the everlasting covenant. That is my covenant unto them, Jacob, when I shall take away their sins. And so, when you read Isaiah 34, I hope I got the right. Yes, Isaiah. So when you read Isaiah 34, this chapter happens because of verse 8. For it is the day of Jehovah's vengeance and a year of recompenses because of the controversy of Zion. Now Isaiah 24 and verse 5 is essentially the same thing. The earth is also defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant. What ordinance did they change? Well, one of the ordinances that they changed was that Israel will be brought back all Israel to be brought back to the land that was once called Palestine by Rome. All of the land that was called Palestine by Rome. And what they did was they made the land smaller and smaller and smaller and wide to make sure that the everlasting covenant could not be implemented. And thereby, in verse 5, they broke the everlasting covenant that Paul was talking about in Romans 11 and verse 25 and 26. And that is the reason why Isaiah 24 happens. It will happen just before Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all the righteous are raised from the dead. Because right here in verse 23, the moon shall be confounded and the sun ashamed when Jehovah of hosts shall reign in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem before the ancient patriarchs gloriously. So they will be raised from the dead, and his promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob will be fulfilled. In spite of the broken promises that the Gentiles have made in the past 100 years. Isaiah 24 and Isaiah 34 be upon them for doing this. They rejected grace, and thereby Israel shall receive that grace instead. They rejected mercy, so Israel is going to receive that mercy instead. The Gentiles rejected salvation, so now Israel will receive that salvation instead. Now, I know that there are some people out there that find my videos offensive. Too bad. If you find my videos offensive, you find the truth offensive. Because I'm going to tell the truth. And I hope to be able to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And as I continue to grow in understanding of the Scripture, I will pass it on and let the chips fall where they may. I am not a hireling. I am not getting paid to do this. And therefore, my message is going to be unpolluted by the love for money. So, if you're offended, well, maybe you need to re-examine your life. What is it that, why are you offended by this? Are you afraid that if you embrace the truth, you're going to lose your money, your wife, your children? Well, your forefathers stole the lives of the wives and children and the money of the Jews. In the name of Jesus, they did. The shoe is going to be on the other foot. If you reject the truth now, you're going to lose all of that you desire anyway. So, better to accept the truth and to lose prestige today than to reject the truth and lose out on everything tomorrow. The choice is yours.